The kiln exploded for the third time in as many months, sending shards of red clay and precious pottery fragments across the dusty Arizona ground. And Grace Emerson dropped to her knees in the dirt. Fighting back tears, she refused to shed in front of the merchants who had gathered to collect their commissioned work. Camp Verde in 1877 was a harsh place for anyone trying to make an honest living, but for a woman alone with nothing but her craft and her stubbornness, it felt nearly impossible. Grace brushed the dust from her worn calico dress and stared at the ruined kiln, its brick walls cracked and crumbling, the mortar having given way yet again to the intense heat required to properly fire her pottery. 3 months of work, dozens of pieces she had shaped with her own hands, all destroyed in an instant. "Miss Emerson, I had customers waiting on those bowls," Mr. Henderson said, his thick mustache twitching with barely concealed frustration. He owned the general store and had commissioned 20 mixing bowls for resale. "I understand, Mr. Henderson. I will remake them as quickly as I can." Grace stood, brushing her hands on her apron, trying to maintain what dignity she had left. "That is what you said last time and the time before that. I cannot keep making promises to my customers that you cannot fulfill." He shook his head, genuine regret in his eyes despite his harsh words. "I am sorry, Miss Emerson, but I will have to find another supplier." Grace watched him walk away, followed by Mrs. Patterson, who had ordered serving platters, and young Timothy Brooks, who had wanted a set of cups for his new bride. One by one, her customers disappeared down the main street of Camp Verde, leaving her alone with her failure and the smoking ruins of her kiln. She was 22 years old and had been on her own for just over a year since her father had died of fever. He had been the potter, the true craftsman, and she had learned everything from him. Her skill with clay was genuine, her eye for form and function sharp, but without a working kiln, she might as well have been trying to sell dirt. The small workshop behind the tiny adobe house her father had built sat in the shadow of the distant mountains. And for the first time since she had committed to making her own way in this unforgiving territory, Grace felt truly defeated. She spent the rest of that sweltering afternoon cleaning up the destruction, salvaging what pieces of brick she could, though most had cracked beyond repair. The sun beat down mercilessly as she worked, and by the time evening shadows stretched long across the yard, her arms ached and her back protested every movement. She stood, hands on her hips, staring at what remained of the kiln structure, and tried to calculate whether she had enough money saved to purchase new bricks and mortar. The answer was no. She barely had enough to feed herself for the next month. Grace was washing her face in the basin inside her small home when she heard the heavy footsteps outside. Her heart jumped, as it always did when unexpected visitors arrived. A woman alone had to be cautious, especially as dusk approached. She dried her hands and face quickly, tucking a strand of her dark brown hair back into the loose braid that hung over her shoulder, and stepped outside. A man stood examining the destroyed kiln, his back to her. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the fading sunlight. Long dark hair fell past his collar, and he wore buckskin pants and a simple cotton shirt that stretched across muscles earned from hard mountain living. A pack sat on the ground beside him, and Grace noticed the quality of his boots, the well-maintained rifle leaning against the adobe wall. "Can I help you?" she called out, keeping her distance. The man turned, and Grace felt her breath catch slightly. He had a strong, weathered face, tanned from long days in the sun, with a dark beard that was neatly trimmed despite what his clothing suggested about his lifestyle. His eyes were a striking gray-blue, and they studied her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of how disheveled she must look after her day of labor and disappointment. "You the potter." His voice was deep, rough from disuse, as if speaking was not something he did often. "I am. Or I was. I suppose that depends on whether you consider someone without a working kiln a potter." The words came out more bitter than she intended. He looked back at the ruins. What happened? The same thing that always happens. The structure could not hold up to the heat. This is the third time. Grace crossed her arms, suddenly defensive. "Are you here to commission work? Because I am not taking any new orders at present. Not here for pottery." He walked around the destroyed kiln, examining it from all angles. His movements were careful, deliberate, like someone accustomed to paying attention to details. "Came down from the mountains to sell furs and pick up supplies. Heard about your trouble at the trading post." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. Of course, the entire town was talking about her repeated failures. In a place as small as Camp Verde, everyone knew everyone else's business. "Well, you have seen it. I appreciate your curiosity, but I have work to do." "You built this yourself?" he asked, ignoring her dismissal. "My father and I built it together 4 years ago. It worked fine when he was alive. Since his death, it has been nothing but problems." The man crouched down, running his large hands over the remaining brickwork. "Your mortar is wrong. Too much sand, not enough lime. And these bricks were not fired hot enough themselves. They are crumbling under repeated heating." Grace stepped closer despite herself. "How do you know about kiln construction?" "Spent time with the Puebloan people up in Colorado before I took to the mountains. Watched them build their kilns, helped them fire their pottery. They have been doing it for hundreds of years, know the right way to build something that lasts." He stood, towering over her by nearly a foot. "Your design is not bad, but your materials are failing you." "I cannot afford new materials," Grace said quietly, hating to admit her poverty to this stranger. He looked at her for a long moment, those gray-blue eyes seeming to see more than she wanted to reveal. "I am Colt Osborne. I have some time before I head back up into the mountains for winter trapping. I could rebuild this for you, do it right." Grace stared at him, suspicious of his offer. "Why would you do that? You do not know me, and I certainly cannot pay you, do not need paying. Got everything I need up in the mountains." He gestured toward the kiln. "But I do not like seeing good work go to waste. You make good pottery, the best in the territory," Grace said with more confidence than she felt at that moment. A hint of a smile touched his lips, barely visible through his beard. "Then you should have a kiln that works. People around here need good pottery, practical things that last. Seems a waste for you to keep struggling with a structure doomed to fail." Grace wanted to refuse. She had learned the hard way that accepting help from men often came with expectations she was not willing to meet. But as she looked at the ruins of her livelihood, at the empty workshop where dozens of pieces of clay waited to be shaped and fired, she felt her resolve weaken. What choice did she have? Without a working kiln, she would have to give up pottery entirely, perhaps take in laundry or try to find work cooking for one of the nearby ranches. The thought of abandoning her father's craft, of letting his legacy die with him, felt like betraying his memory. "All right," she said finally, "but I insist on helping. This is my kiln, my livelihood. I want to learn how to build it properly." Colt nodded as if he had expected nothing less. "We start tomorrow at dawn. It is going to take at least a week, maybe longer. I will need to source better materials, and the construction has to be done carefully." "I will have breakfast ready," Grace heard herself say, then immediately wondered what had possessed her to make such an offer. Appreciated. He picked up his pack and rifle. "I have been staying at the boarding house, but the proprietor and I had a disagreement about his treatment of the Chinese laundry workers. I will make camp outside of town." Grace surprised herself again. "There is a shed behind the workshop. My father used it for storage, but it has a solid roof and walls. You are welcome to sleep there if you prefer. It would be more convenient for the work." Colt studied her face, and she got the distinct impression he was assessing whether she was genuinely comfortable with the arrangement or simply being polite. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded once. "That would be fine. Thank you, Miss Emerson." "Grace," she said. "If you are going to be rebuilding my kiln, you might as well call me Grace." "Colt," he replied, though she already knew his name. "I will get my things." After he left, Grace went back inside her small home and sank into the single chair at her kitchen table, wondering what she had just agreed to. She knew nothing about this man except that he was a mountain man, a trapper who spent most of his time in isolation, and that he somehow knew about kiln construction. For all she knew, he could be dangerous or worse, simply taking advantage of her desperation. But something in his eyes had seemed honest, and his criticism of her kiln construction had been accurate enough that she believed his claim about learning from the Puebloan people. More than that, she was out of options. Winter would come eventually, and she needed to re-establish her business before the harsh weather set in and made both pottery work and travel more difficult. She stood and began preparing a larger supper than she usually made for herself, figuring that a man of Colt's size would need substantial food after his travels. She had beans that had been soaking, some dried beef, and she made cornbread in her small oven. It felt strange to be cooking for someone else after so long alone, but not entirely unpleasant. When Colt returned as the last light faded from the sky, he had with him not just his pack and rifle but also several wrapped bundles that looked like they contained furs. He nodded to her as he passed, taking his things to the shed, and she noticed how quietly he moved despite his size. She had heard that mountain men learned to move silently for hunting, and apparently the skill became second nature. She called him for supper, and he washed at the pump outside before joining her. Her home was small, just a single room with her bed in one corner, the kitchen area with its small stove and table in another, and her father's old trunk and few pieces of furniture filling the remaining space. Colt had to duck slightly to enter through the doorway, and his presence seemed to fill the entire room. They ate in awkward silence at first. Grace was not accustomed to entertaining, and Colt seemed like a man who had grown comfortable with silence in his solitary mountain life. But as the meal progressed, she found her curiosity overcoming her reticence. "How long have you been a trapper?" she asked. "5 years, give or take. Came west after the war." He did not specify which side he had fought for, and Grace did not ask. The war had ended more than a decade ago, but the wounds it had left were still tender for many. "Tried settling in Denver for a while, but city life did not suit me. Headed into the mountains and found I preferred the solitude. You ever get lonely?" He considered the question seriously before answering. "Sometimes, but people can be more exhausting than loneliness. In the mountains, things are simple. You hunt, you trap, you survive. You do not have to worry about politics or social expectations or what others think of you." Grace understood that sentiment more than she cared to admit. "I imagine people think it is strange, a woman running a pottery business alone. People think a lot of things. Does not make them right." He finished his cornbread and looked at her directly. "You are making your own way, supporting yourself with honest work. That is more than most can say, man or woman." The simple acceptance in his words eased something tight in her chest that Grace had not realized was there. "Thank you for saying that." They discussed the kiln project after that, and Colt sketched out on a piece of paper the design he had in mind. He would need to acquire better bricks, either by purchasing them from a supplier in Prescott or by making them himself if he could find suitable clay. The mortar would need to be mixed with the proper proportions of lime, sand, and water. The structure would be slightly larger than her previous kiln, with thicker walls and a better ventilation system to allow for more even heat distribution. It will take longer to heat, he explained, but once it reaches temperature, it will hold steady longer and cool down more gradually. That is what you want for pottery. Sudden temperature changes cause cracking. Grace listened intently, asking questions and making notes. If she was going to learn to maintain and eventually rebuild this kiln herself in the future, she needed to understand every aspect of its construction. Colt seemed pleased by her attention to detail, his explanations becoming more thorough as he realized she was genuinely interested in the technical aspects. When the evening grew late, Colt thanked her for the meal and retired to the shed. Grace cleaned up the dishes and prepared for bed, but sleep eluded her for a long time. She lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the desert night, and thought about the strange turn her life had taken. This morning she had been alone and nearly hopeless. Now she had a mountain man sleeping in her shed who had promised to rebuild her kiln and restore her livelihood. She told herself to be cautious, to guard her heart and her trust. But some small part of her, the part that had been lonely for longer than she wanted to admit, whispered that maybe this was the beginning of something more than just a rebuilt kiln. The following morning, Grace woke before dawn and prepared breakfast as promised. She made eggs from her small clutch of hens, more cornbread, and strong coffee. Colt appeared just as the sun began to lighten the eastern sky, his hair damp from washing at the pump. They ate quickly, and then he led her to examine what remained of her kiln more thoroughly in the growing light. "First thing we need to do is completely dismantle this," he said. "Save any bricks that are still solid, but most of these are going to need to be replaced. You have clay on your property," Grace nodded. "There is a deposit about a quarter-mile east, near the creek bed. That is where my father and I sourced clay for pottery. Show me. If it is good quality, we can make our own bricks. It will take longer, but it will be cheaper, and we can control the quality." They walked together through the desert morning, the air still cool before the sun climbed high enough to bake the earth. Grace led him to the clay deposit, a reddish-brown earth exposed where the seasonal creek had cut through the landscape. Colt crouched down and examined it carefully, breaking off a piece and working it between his strong fingers. "This is good clay, high in iron. It will make strong bricks." He looked up at her. "Do you have molds?" "My father had wooden forms for making adobe bricks. Would those work?" "Perfect." "We will spend today digging clay and tomorrow forming bricks. They will need at least 3 days to dry before we can fire them, longer if the humidity is high." He stood, surveying the area. "We are going to need a lot of clay. This is going to be hard work." Grace rolled up her sleeves. "I am not afraid of hard work." They spent that entire day digging clay and hauling it back to her property in buckets. It was back-breaking labor, and by midday Grace's arms burned and her back ached, but she refused to slow down or complain. Colt worked at a steady, tireless pace, his powerful muscles making the heavy work look easier than it was. Grace found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking, fascinated by the efficient way he moved, the sheer strength he possessed. They broke for lunch, and Grace served cold beans and bread. They ate sitting in the shade of the workshop, too tired to talk much. Grace noticed that Colt had removed his shirt due to the heat, and she tried not to stare at the expanse of his chest and shoulders, the muscles that bunched and moved under his tanned skin. She felt heat in her face that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. When he caught her looking, she quickly turned away, embarrassed. But when she glanced back, she thought she saw something warm in his eyes, an awareness that had not been there before. "You are a hard worker," he said after a moment. "Not many women I have met could keep up with this kind of labor. Not many women you have met have had to support themselves alone in the Arizona territory," Grace replied. "You learn to do what needs doing. How did your father die, if you do not mind me asking?" Grace set down her plate, the familiar grief rising in her chest. "Fever last year. It came on sudden and took him within days. There was nothing I could do." She swallowed hard. "He was all I had. My mother died when I was young and we moved out here for his health. He had been injured during the war, and the doctors said the dry climate would be better for his lungs." "I am sorry," Colt said, and the simplicity of his condolence was more comforting than the elaborate sympathies she had received from townspeople. "He taught me everything about pottery. Not just the craft, but the business of it. He wanted to make sure I could take care of myself if anything happened to him." She smiled sadly. "He would be disappointed to see how much I have been struggling with the kiln. He would be proud that you kept trying, that you did not give up." Colt's voice was firm. "Failure is only final when you stop attempting." They returned to work, and by the time the sun began to set, they had accumulated enough clay for the first batch of bricks. Grace's entire body ached, and her hands were raw despite her work gloves. Colt showed her how to mix the clay with water and sand in the proper proportions, how to work out air bubbles that would cause weak spots. "Tomorrow we form the bricks," he said as they cleaned up for the evening. "Your arms are going to hurt even worse." "They already hurt worse than I thought possible," Grace admitted. "But I will be ready." Over supper that night, they talked more easily than they had the previous evening. Colt told her stories about his time in the mountains, about tracking elk through deep snow, about the incredible silence of a forest after a storm. Grace found herself drawn into his descriptions, fascinated by a world so different from her own experience. "It sounds beautiful," she said wistfully. "Lonely, but beautiful." "It is both," Colt agreed. "But lately, the loneliness has been weighing heavier than it used to." He looked at her across the table. "That is part of why I agreed to this project. Seemed like a good reason to stay in civilization a bit longer." Grace felt her heart beat faster at his words, at the implication behind them. She was acutely aware of how close they were sitting, of the way the lamplight cast shadows across his face, softening the hard edges. "I am glad you did," she said softly. "I do not know what I would have done without your help. You would have figured something out. You are that kind of person." His eyes held hers, "stubborn and determined." "Is that a compliment?" "The highest one I know." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Then Colt stood, breaking the spell. "Early morning tomorrow. You should get some rest." After he left, Grace sat alone in the lamplight for a long while, her heart confused and her mind racing. She barely knew this man, yet she felt drawn to him in ways she had not experienced before. She had been courted by a few young men in town, but none had interested her. They had seemed frivolous or dismissive of her craft, unable to see past the fact that she was a woman in a man's profession. Colt was different. He respected her work, her determination. He did not try to coddle her or suggest that she should abandon her pottery for more appropriate female pursuits. He simply helped her, treated her as a capable equal, and in doing so made her feel seen in a way she had not felt since her father's death. She went to bed that night with Colt's face in her thoughts, and woke the next morning with renewed energy despite her aching muscles. They spent that day forming bricks, carefully pressing the clay mixture into wooden molds, and then turning them out to dry on boards in the sun. It was meticulous, repetitive work, but Grace found it satisfying to see the rows of bricks growing, to know that each one brought her closer to a functioning kiln. Colt worked beside her, his large hands surprisingly deft at the detailed work. They developed a rhythm, working in companionable silence broken by occasional conversation. Grace learned that he was 28 years old, that he had grown up on a farm in Missouri, that he had lost his entire family to illness before the war. "That is part of why I prefer the mountains," he admitted. "Getting close to people means risking loss. In the wilderness, the only life at stake is my own." "That sounds like a lonely way to live," Grace said gently. "It has been, but safe." He met her eyes. "Though lately, I have been wondering if safe is the same thing as living." The days blended together in a pattern of hard work and growing closeness. While the bricks dried, Colt dismantled the rest of Grace's old kiln, carefully sorting materials that could be reused from those that needed to be discarded. Grace spent time in her workshop, shaping new pottery to replace what had been lost in the explosion. She found her creativity flowing more freely than it had in months, inspired perhaps by the promise of a kiln that would actually work. In the evenings, they shared meals and conversation. Colt proved to be surprisingly well-read despite his isolated lifestyle. He carried books in his pack and would read by firelight in his mountain cabin during the long winter months. They discovered a shared love of poetry, and Grace found herself reciting verses her father had taught her, while Colt listened with apparent pleasure. One evening, about 5 days into the project, Grace was reading aloud from a worn collection of poems while Colt repaired a piece of his trapping equipment. She glanced up from the page and found him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You have a beautiful voice," he said simply. "I was just thinking how much I have enjoyed these evenings." Grace set the book down, her heart racing. "I have enjoyed them too, more than I expected to." Colt set aside his work and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Grace, I need to be honest with you about something." Her stomach tightened with apprehension. "All right. When I heard about your kiln troubles, I did not come here just to help with construction. I came because I was curious about you." He ran a hand through his hair, seeming unusually uncomfortable. "The men at the trading post were talking about the stubborn potter who kept failing but would not give up. Something about that stuck with me. I wanted to meet the woman who had that kind of determination." Grace did not know what to say. Her mind raced with implications and possibilities. "I know I am just a mountain man with nothing to offer but pelts and solitude," Colt continued. "But these past few days working with you, talking with you, I have felt something I have not felt in years, maybe ever." He met her eyes directly. "I am interested in you, Grace, more than interested. And I needed you to know that before I finish this kiln and leave, because I do not want there to be dishonesty between us." Grace stood, her legs suddenly unsteady. She walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky, her emotions tumbling over each other. She was attracted to Colt, she could not deny that, but attraction was easy. The question was whether she was willing to risk opening her heart to someone, especially someone whose life was so different from her own. "I have been alone for a long time," she said quietly. "I learned to rely on myself, to not need anyone. It felt safer that way. I understand that. I have been doing the same thing for 5 years." She turned to face him. "But these past few days, I have remembered what it feels like to have someone to talk to work alongside. And I find myself dreading the day when you finish the kiln and leave." Colt stood, crossing the small room to stand before her. He was so tall that she had to tilt her head back to look at his face. "Then maybe I do not have to leave. Not immediately, anyway." "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I could stay in Camp Verde for a while longer. Help you get your business back on track, make sure the kiln works properly. There is time before I need to return to my trap lines." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. "I am saying that I would like to see where this thing between us might lead if you are willing." Grace leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. When she opened them, she saw the hope and vulnerability in his face, and her decision crystallized. "I would like that too." Colt smiled, a true smile that transformed his weathered face into something almost boyish. Then, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, he leaned down and kissed her. His lips were soft against hers, the kiss gentle and questioning. Grace felt warmth spread through her entire body, and she reached up to touch his bearded jaw, kissing him back with growing confidence. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing harder. Colt rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the first day I saw you covered in clay dust and looking so fiercely determined." Grace laughed, the sound surprised and delighted. "I must have looked a mess." "You looked beautiful. You still do." They stood together in the lamplight, holding each other, and Grace felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope, not just for her business or her future, but for something deeper and more profound. The possibility of love, of partnership, of not being alone anymore. The next morning, they began constructing the new kiln. The bricks had dried sufficiently, and Colt had prepared the mortar with careful attention to the proper proportions. He showed Grace how to lay the bricks, how to ensure each course was level, how to create the interior chamber that would hold her pottery and the firebox that would generate the heat. It was exacting work that required patience and precision, two qualities Grace was developing under Colt's steady guidance. He was a patient teacher, never condescending, always willing to explain the reasoning behind each step. When she made mistakes, he showed her how to correct them without making her feel foolish. As the kiln took shape, several townspeople stopped by to watch the progress. Mrs. Patterson came with her daughter, curious about the new design. Even Mr. Henderson from the general store appeared one afternoon, clearly intrigued by the substantial structure rising in Grace's yard. "That is quite the kiln you are building, Miss Emerson," he commented, walking around it to examine from all angles. "Much more substantial than your previous one. Colt has been teaching me the proper construction techniques," Grace said, unable to keep the pride from her voice. "This one should last for decades." Henderson looked at Colt with new respect. "You are the trapper who was at the trading post last week, are you not? The one who objected to how old Chang was being treated." Colt straightened from his work. "That would be me." "Well, I appreciate a man who stands up for what is right, even when it is unpopular." Henderson extended his hand. "If Miss Emerson can start producing pottery again with reliability, I would be happy to resume our business arrangement. I never doubted her skill, only her equipment." After Henderson left, Grace threw her arms around Colt in excitement. "Do you realize what this means? If Henderson spreads the word that I am back in business, my other customers might return too." Colt hugged her back, lifting her briefly off her feet. "That is exactly what should happen. Your work is too good to be wasted." Over the following days, as the kiln neared completion, Grace and Colt's relationship deepened naturally. They worked side by side during the day, their movements becoming synchronized as they developed an unspoken understanding of each other's rhythms. In the evenings, they talked about everything and nothing, sharing their pasts and tentatively discussing their futures. Colt told her about his plans for his trap lines, about the cabin he had built with his own hands in a valley high in the mountains of Colorado. Grace described her dreams for her pottery business, how she wanted to create not just practical pieces but beautiful ones too, decorative work that captured the colors and spirit of the Arizona desert. "Would you ever want to leave Camp Verde?" Colt asked one evening as they sat outside under the stars. Grace considered the question carefully. I do not know. This is where my father built our life, where all my memories of him are, but I suppose I could be happy anywhere as long as I could practice my craft. She looked at him. Why do you ask? Just thinking about the future, about what might be possible. He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I have been alone by choice for so long, but being here with you has made me realize what I have been missing. The mountains are beautiful, but they are cold. Here with you, I feel warm in a way that has nothing to do with the Arizona sun. Grace's heart swelled at his words. I have been thinking about that too, about what happens after the kiln is finished. I do not want to leave, Grace, not unless you want me to. I do not want you to leave either. She squeezed his hand. But I also do not want you to give up your life in the mountains for me. That would not be fair. What if we could find a balance? I could stay here most of the year, help you with your business, only go north for the prime trapping months in deep winter. The money from my furs could support us during slower pottery seasons. He turned to face her fully. I know this is fast, and I know we have only known each other a couple of weeks, but I feel more certain about this than I have felt about anything in my life. I want to build a life with you, Grace, if you will have me. Tears pricked Grace's eyes, happy tears this time. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I want that too. Colt pulled her into his arms and kissed her deeply, pouring all his feeling into the embrace. Grace kissed him back with equal passion, her hands tangling in his hair, her heart soaring with joy and certainty. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling. I love you, Colt said, the words rough with emotion. I know it is too soon to say it, but it is true. I love you, Grace Emerson. It is not too soon, Grace replied, touching his face tenderly. I love you too, Colt Osborne. I think I have been falling in love with you since you first examined my ruined kiln and offered to help. They stayed outside late into the night, making plans and dreaming together. They talked about expanding Grace's workshop, about the kinds of pottery she could create with a reliable kiln. Colt mentioned teaching her some of the survival skills he had learned, thinking that understanding more about the natural materials available might inspire new glazes and designs. The Puebloan potters use minerals from the earth to create different colors, he explained. Copper for green and blue, iron for red and brown, manganese for black. If we explore the area around Camp Verde, we might find sources for natural pigments. Grace was enchanted by the idea. I would love that. My father and I always used simple glazes, but I have wanted to experiment with more decorative finishes. The kiln was completed 2 days later. It stood solid and impressive, its walls thick and true, its design incorporating all the lessons Colt had learned from the Puebloan people. Grace stood back and admired it with a sense of accomplishment and relief. This was not just a kiln. It was a symbol of her resilience, of the help that had come when she most needed it, of the unexpected love that had grown from shared work and mutual respect. Ready to fire it up? Colt asked, his hand warm on her shoulder. Ready as I will ever be, Grace replied, though her voice was tight with nervousness. So much depended on this working. Not just her business, but her confidence in her ability to continue her father's legacy. They had prepared for this moment carefully. Grace had shaped 24 pieces over the past week, simpler items that would be less heartbreaking to lose if something went wrong. Bowls, cups, plates, all carefully dried and ready for firing. Together, they loaded the pieces into the kiln's interior chamber, arranging them on shelves Colt had built specifically for this purpose. Colt showed Grace how to start the fire in the firebox, how to gradually increase the temperature to avoid thermal shock to the pottery. It is going to take hours to reach full temperature, he explained. And then it needs to hold steady for several more hours. This is not something we can rush. They took turns feeding the fire throughout the day and into the night. The kiln performed beautifully, the thick walls holding heat efficiently, the ventilation system drawing air through exactly as designed. As the hours passed, and the structure showed no signs of the stress fractures that had plagued Grace's previous kiln, she began to relax. By dawn the next morning, the firing was complete. Now came the hardest part, waiting for the kiln to cool slowly enough that the pottery inside would not crack. They let the fire die naturally, and then simply had to be patient. Grace was too nervous to work on anything else, so they spent the day exploring the area around Camp Verde. Colt showed her how to identify different types of clay deposits, how to recognize mineral outcroppings that might contain useful pigments for glazes. They collected samples in a canvas bag, and Colt explained how each might be processed and tested. "You have such knowledge about so many things," Grace marveled as they hiked through the scrubland. "Not just about kilns and pottery, but about the land itself. When you spend as much time alone as I have, you learn to observe everything around you. The land teaches you if you are willing to learn." He helped her over a rocky section. "But I am realizing that I was only learning one kind of lesson in the mountains. Being here with you has taught me different things. About trust, about letting someone in, about what it means to build something together instead of always being solitary." They returned to Grace's property as the sun was setting. The kiln had cooled enough that they could safely open it in the morning. Grace prepared a celebratory dinner, or as celebratory as her limited supplies allowed. She made a rabbit stew from a pear Colt had snared, with wild onions and the last of her stored vegetables. Over dinner, they talked about the future more concretely. Colt would stay through the fall, helping Grace re-establish her pottery business and build up her inventory. Before winter set in, he would make one trip north to his cabin to collect his belongings and settle his trap lines for the season. He would return by Christmas, and they would face the winter together in Camp Verde. "And in the spring?" Grace asked. "In the spring, I would like to marry you," Colt said, his gray-blue eyes serious. "If you will have me. I know we should probably wait longer, do things properly, but I am not getting any younger and I know what I want." Grace felt tears threaten again, the good kind. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you. I do not need a long courtship to know that you are the man I want to spend my life with." Colt came around the table and pulled her into his arms, holding her close. Grace wrapped her arms around his solid body, feeling safe and cherished in a way she had never experienced before. They stayed like that for a long time, just holding each other, both marveling at how quickly and completely their lives had changed. The next morning they opened the kiln together. Grace's hands trembled as Colt carefully removed the first piece, a simple bowl. It was perfect, the clay fired to a smooth, even finish, no cracks or flaws visible. One by one they removed the pieces, and every single one had survived the firing intact. Grace let out a whoop of joy and threw herself into Colt's arms. "It worked. It actually worked." He laughed, spinning her around. "Of course it worked. I told you it would." They spent the morning examining each piece, and Grace was thrilled with the results. The pottery was everything she had hoped for, properly vitrified and strong. These pieces would last for decades with proper care. She could hardly wait to show them to her former customers and prove that she was back in business. Word spread quickly through Camp Verde that Grace's new kiln had been successfully fired. Within days, customers began returning, placing new orders. Mr. Henderson came himself to examine the finished pieces and immediately ordered 40 bowls and 20 serving platters. Mrs. Patterson wanted a complete dinner service. Even people who had never commissioned work from Grace before stopped by, intrigued by the quality of her pottery and the story of the mountain man who had rebuilt her kiln. Colt stayed in the background during these business transactions, but Grace made sure everyone knew of his contribution. "I could not have done this without him," she told each customer. "He saved my livelihood." The days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Grace worked in her studio, creating pieces that combined practical function with increasing artistic ambition. The mineral samples they had collected proved useful, and she began experimenting with natural glazes that produced subtle earth tones and occasionally surprising blues and greens. Colt helped with the heavy work of digging clay and firing the kiln, but he also took on other tasks around the property, making repairs that Grace's father had left unfinished and improvements that made her life easier. He fixed the roof of her house, replaced worn hinges on doors, built better shelving in her workshop. Grace watched him work and felt her love for him deepen daily. He was not just strong and capable, though he was certainly both of those things. He was also thoughtful and generous, always looking for ways to make her life better without being asked. In turn, Grace took care of him in ways he was not accustomed to. She cooked meals that were far better than the simple camp food he usually ate. She mended his clothes and ensured he had clean laundry. More than that, she provided companionship and affection, drawing him out of the shell of solitude he had built around himself over the years. They went into town together one Saturday, and Grace introduced Colt to everyone they met. Some of the townspeople were skeptical of the rough mountain man, but most welcomed him when they saw how happy Grace was and how respectfully he treated her. They purchased supplies at Henderson's store, and Grace felt a sense of pride walking beside Colt, this strong, capable man who had chosen her. At the dry goods section, they ran into a problem. A man named Frank Butler, a rancher who had previously shown unwelcome interest in Grace, made a rude comment about the potter finally finding someone desperate enough to take her on. Colt went very still, and Grace felt the tension in his body, but before he could respond, she spoke up herself. "Mr. Butler, Colt is not desperate. He is the best thing that has happened to me, and I am grateful every day that he came to Camp Verde. Your opinion on the matter is neither requested nor relevant." Butler's face reddened, but before he could respond, Henderson himself intervened. "Mr. Butler, I think you should apologize to Miss Emerson or take your business elsewhere." Butler muttered something that might have been an apology and left the store. Henderson nodded to Grace and Colt. "I will not tolerate disrespect toward my customers, especially ones as valued as yourself, Miss Emerson." Outside, Colt pulled Grace aside. "You handled that well. I have learned that I need to stand up for myself. No one else will do it for me." She smiled up at him. "Though I appreciate that you were ready to defend my honor." "Always," he said seriously. "But you are right that you do not need me to fight your battles. You are more than capable." He kissed her forehead. "That does not mean I would not enjoy teaching Butler some manners, however." Grace laughed and took his arm as they continued their errands. She felt eyes on them, knew that their relationship was the subject of gossip, but she did not care. Let them talk. She was happy, truly happy, for the first time since her father's death. As autumn deepened and the days grew shorter, Grace's business flourished. The new kiln performed flawlessly, firing load after load of pottery without any problems. Grace was able to take on more ambitious projects, including a special commission from a wealthy family in Prescott for a complete set of serving dishes, decorated with scenes of desert wildlife. She worked on these pieces with special care, using the natural glazes she and Colt had developed to create subtle colorations that evoked the Arizona landscape. Colt helped her with the designs, describing animals he had seen in the wild with such detail that Grace could capture their essence in clay. Eagles soaring, deer drinking from a stream, even a mountain lion crouched on a rock. "These are beautiful," Colt said as he watched her work. "You are putting your heart into them." "I am happy," Grace said simply. "When you are happy, it shows in your work." The pieces were fired successfully, and when the family from Prescott came to collect them, they were effusive in their praise. They paid Grace more than she had asked, insisting that the quality far exceeded their expectations, and they promised to recommend her work to their friends and associates. That night, Grace and Colt celebrated with a bottle of wine that Mrs. Patterson had gifted her after Grace had completed her dinner service. They sat outside under the stars, wrapped in blankets against the cool autumn air, and talked about their dreams. "I have been thinking," Colt said, his arm around Grace's shoulders, "about the future, about children." Grace felt her heart skip. They had not yet discussed that particular aspect of their future, though she had certainly thought about it. "What about children?" "I want them. Someday, not immediately, but someday. I want to have a family with you to fill this place with life and laughter." He looked down at her. "How do you feel about that?" "I want that too," Grace said softly. "I want to have your children to build that family with you. My father would have loved to have grandchildren. I think he would approve of you. I wish I could have met him." "So do I. But I think he sent you to me in a way. The kiln breaking down again and again, until you heard about it and came to help. Maybe that was his way of making sure I would not be alone." Colt kissed her tenderly. "Then I am grateful to him for that gift." They made love that night for the first time, in Grace's small house with moonlight streaming through the window. It was tender and passionate, both of them nervous and eager, learning each other's bodies with the same care they had brought to rebuilding the kiln. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, Grace felt complete in a way she had not known was possible. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Colt replied, his deep voice rumbling in his chest beneath her ear. "More than I thought I could love anyone." As November approached, they began planning Colt's trip north to his cabin. He would be gone for at least 3 weeks, possibly a month depending on weather and trail conditions. Grace dreaded his departure but understood its necessity. He needed to collect his belongings and, more importantly, he needed to make arrangements for his trap lines. He had contacts among other trappers who could work his territories for a percentage, ensuring that his investment in establishing those lines would not be completely lost. "I will be back before Christmas," he promised. "I do not want to spend the holiday without you." "I will count every day until you return," Grace said, holding him tight. They spent his last few days in Camp Verde preparing for his absence. Colt split enough firewood to last Grace through several weeks, and made sure all the repairs around her property were complete. He showed her again how to fire the kiln on her own, making her walk through the entire process, while he observed to ensure she understood every step. "You can do this," he assured her. "You do not need me here for the pottery work. You are a master craftsman, Grace." "But I want you here," she said, unable to keep the catch from her voice. "And I want to be here. That is why I am coming back. This is not goodbye, Grace. This is just a temporary separation." On the morning of his departure, Grace woke before dawn to prepare him a good breakfast and pack food for his journey. Colt loaded his pack, checked his rifle, and then held Grace for a long moment outside her door. 3 weeks, he said firmly. 4 at the most. Then I will be back and we will start planning our wedding. "I will be waiting," Grace promised, fighting back tears. "Be safe, Colt. Please be safe. Always. I have too much to live for now to take unnecessary risks." He kissed her deeply, then mounted his horse and rode away as the sun rose over the mountains. Grace stood watching until he disappeared from view, then went inside and allowed herself to cry. She had known this separation was coming, had prepared herself for it, but the reality of his absence hit harder than she expected. The small house felt empty without him, the shed behind her workshop a lonely reminder of where he had slept before they had become lovers. But Grace was not the same woman who had watched her kiln explode months ago. She was stronger now, more confident, and she had work to do. She threw herself into her pottery with renewed energy, determined to build up a substantial inventory while Colt was away. She had orders to fill, new ideas to explore, and a business to run. The first week passed slowly. Grace worked long hours in her studio, fired the kiln successfully twice on her own, and tried not to count the days until Colt's return. She had dinner with Mrs. Patterson and her family one evening, and the older woman's knowing smile made Grace blush. "You are in love," Mrs. Patterson observed. "It is written all over your face." "I am," Grace admitted. "I did not expect it, but he is everything I could have hoped for. He is a good man, anyone can see that, and he looks at you like you hung the moon and stars." Mrs. Patterson patted her hand. "Your father would be happy to know you are not alone anymore." The second week was easier. Grace settled into the rhythm of work and solitary evenings. She read the books Colt had left behind, finding comfort in knowing he had held these same pages. She experimented with new glaze combinations and was thrilled when one produced a deep turquoise, unlike anything she had achieved before. Halfway through the third week, a storm rolled through Camp Verde, bringing cold rain that turned the streets to mud and kept Grace inside for 2 days. She worried about Colt, hoping he was safe and dry somewhere, but she trusted his wilderness skills. He had survived 5 years alone in the mountains. He could certainly handle a rainstorm. On the morning of the 21st day since his departure, Grace was in her workshop when she heard a horse approaching. Her heart leaped, and she ran outside, not caring that her hands were covered in wet clay. Colt dismounted and caught her as she threw herself into his arms. "You are back early," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I rode hard, could not stay away any longer." He kissed her thoroughly, not caring about the clay now smearing his shirt. "I missed you, Grace. Every single day, every single moment. I missed you too, so much." She pulled back to look at him, checking for injuries or illness, relieved to find him looking healthy if road weary. "How was the trip? Did you get everything settled?" "Everything is arranged. I sold my cabin to another trapper, someone I trust to maintain it properly. He will work my trap lines and send me a percentage of the profits. I collected my personal belongings, settled my debts, said my goodbyes to the few people I knew up there." He cupped her face in his hands. "I am done with that life, Grace. My future is here now with you." They went inside and Grace prepared him a hot meal while he washed off the trail dust. He told her about his journey, about the early snow that had already fallen in the high mountains, about the strange feeling of leaving his cabin for the last time. "I thought I would feel sad," he admitted. "That place was my home for 5 years, but all I felt was eager to get back here. This is home now. Wherever you are is home." Grace's eyes filled with happy tears. "You are home now too. My home, my heart, my future." They spent the rest of that day and evening simply being together, relearning each other's presence, talking and touching and reconnecting. That night when they made love, it felt different than before, deeper somehow. This was not just passion but commitment, the physical expression of their choice to build a life together. The next morning, they began planning their wedding in earnest. Camp Verde did not have a regular church, but a circuit preacher came through every few weeks. They learned that he would be in town the second week of December, and they decided that would be the perfect time. A Christmas wedding. Grace said with delight. "My father always loved Christmas." They made arrangements with Henderson to use the space behind his general store for a small reception. Mrs. Patterson and several other women in town insisted on helping with food and decorations. The entire community, it seemed, had embraced their relationship and was excited to celebrate the union. Grace commissioned a new dress from the seamstress in town, a simple but elegant design in deep blue wool that would be practical for winter, but still special. Colt purchased a new suit, looking uncomfortable but determined when he tried it on. Grace had never seen him in anything but his work clothes, and the sight of him dressed formally took her breath away. "You look so handsome," she said, unable to hide her admiration. "I feel like a dressed-up bear," he muttered, tugging at the collar. "But if it makes you happy, I will wear whatever you want." The weeks leading up to the wedding were busy and joyful. Grace continued her pottery work, and Colt helped her while also taking on odd jobs around town to earn additional money. He repaired roofs, built fences, and used his considerable strength to help ranchers with various heavy tasks. People in Camp Verde came to respect him not just as Grace's intended, but as a valuable member of the community in his own right. One evening, about a week before the wedding, they sat together working on vows. Grace wanted to write her own, and Colt, after some hesitation, agreed to do the same. "I am not good with fancy words," he worried. "I do not want fancy words, I want honest ones. Tell me what is in your heart." He was quiet for a long moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he began to speak, his deep voice rough with emotion. "When I came to Camp Verde, I was half a man. I had survived, but I had not truly lived in years. You brought me back to life, Grace. You showed me that walls built for protection can also become prisons. You taught me that love is not weakness but the greatest strength of all." He met her eyes. "I vow to spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you never regret taking a chance on a broken-down mountain man. I will protect you, provide for you, stand beside you in all things. I will love you with everything I am, for as long as I draw breath." Grace was crying openly by the time he finished. "That was beautiful, Colt. Perfect." "Your turn," he said gently. Grace took a shaky breath. "I was lost when you found me. Not just my kiln, but my hope, my faith in the future. You rebuilt more than just bricks and mortar. You rebuilt my life, my dreams, my heart." She reached for his hand. "I vow to be your partner in all things, to value your strength while honoring your gentleness. I promise to create beauty in our life together, to fill our home with love and laughter. I will stand with you through whatever storms come, and I will love you faithfully until my last breath and beyond." They held each other, both moved by the promises they had made. The wedding was not just a ceremony to them, but a sacred commitment, a joining of two people who had found in each other what they had been missing. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, perfect winter weather for Arizona. Grace woke early, too excited to sleep, and spent the morning getting ready with help from Mrs. Patterson and several other women from town. They fixed her hair, helped her into her new dress, and presented her with a bouquet of dried flowers and greenery they had gathered. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Patterson said, her eyes shining with tears. "Like an angel." Grace hardly recognized herself in the small mirror. She did look beautiful, she realized with surprise. Not because of the dress or the hairstyle, but because of the joy and love that radiated from her face. This was what happiness looked like. The ceremony was held in the afternoon at the small meeting hall Camp Verde used for community gatherings. The room was decorated with pine boughs and candles, creating a warm and festive atmosphere despite the simple setting. The entire town seemed to have turned out, filling the chairs and standing along the walls. Colt stood at the front with the circuit preacher, And when Grace entered and saw him, her breath caught. He looked magnificent in his new suit, his long dark hair neatly combed, his gray-blue eyes locked on her with such love and intensity that she felt it like a physical touch. She walked down the short aisle toward him, feeling like she was walking toward her destiny. When she reached his side, Colt took her hands in his, and she could feel the slight tremor in his fingers. He was nervous, she realized with tenderness. This strong, capable man was nervous about marrying her. The ceremony was traditional, the preacher's words time-honored and meaningful. But when it came time for their personal vows, Grace felt the room fade away until it was just the two of them, speaking their truths to each other before God and their community. Colt's voice was steady and sure as he repeated the promises he had made to her in private, and Grace spoke her vows with equal conviction. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Colt kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to many eyes in the audience. The reception was a joyful affair. Henderson had outdone himself, providing tables laden with food and drink. There was music from a fiddler and dancing, though Colt claimed he did not know how. Grace taught him a simple waltz, and they moved together awkwardly at first, then with increasing confidence as they lost themselves in each other's eyes. "I love you, Mrs. Osborne," Colt whispered against her hair as they danced. Grace smiled, loving the sound of her new name. "I love you too, Mr. Osborne, now and always." They stayed at the reception until evening, accepting congratulations and good wishes from everyone in attendance. Even Frank Butler appeared briefly, offering a grudging congratulation that Colt accepted graciously. When the party finally wound down, they walked home together through the cold December night, arms around each other, to begin their life as husband and wife. Their wedding night was everything Grace had dreamed it would be, tender and passionate, a celebration of their love and commitment. Afterward, lying in Colt's arms in the darkness, Grace felt a peace and contentment she had never known before. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For hearing about my broken kiln and deciding to help. For rebuilding more than just bricks and mortar. For loving me." Colt kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for letting me. For seeing past the rough mountain man to the heart underneath. For giving me a reason to live instead of just survive." Winter passed in a blur of work and love. Grace's pottery business continued to thrive, and Colt proved invaluable not just as help but as a business partner. He handled negotiations with customers, managed the financial aspects of the business, and used his strength for the heavy labor while respecting Grace's artistic vision and skill. They developed new techniques together, experimenting with different clays and glazes. Colt's knowledge of the natural world combined with Grace's artistic sensibility created unique pieces that began to attract attention beyond Camp Verde. Orders came from as far away as Phoenix and Tucson, and Grace found herself working longer hours to keep up with demand. But they made sure to save time for each other, for quiet evenings together, for making love and making plans. They talked about expanding the workshop, perhaps taking on an apprentice to help with the increased workload. They discussed buying the land adjacent to Grace's property to ensure they would have room to grow. As spring arrived and the desert bloomed with wildflowers, Grace realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had waited to be certain before telling Colt. She chose a warm evening when they were sitting outside watching the sunset to share the news. "Colt, I have something to tell you." He looked at her, immediately alert to the importance in her tone. "What is it?" "I am with child. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Colt seemed frozen, processing her words. Then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen from him. He stood, pulling her up and into his arms, holding her carefully as if she were made of the most delicate porcelain. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Grace asked, though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Happy does not begin to cover it. Grace, you have given me everything. A home, love, purpose, and now a family." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I never thought I would have this. I thought I would die alone in the mountains someday. But now I have everything I never knew I wanted." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Grace continued her pottery work, though Colt became increasingly protective as her belly grew, insisting she avoid the heavy lifting and take frequent rests. She found his protective nature endearing rather than stifling, touched by how much he cared for her well-being and that of their unborn child. They prepared the small house for the baby's arrival, and Colt built a beautiful cradle from pine wood, carving it with intricate designs of desert animals. Grace made small bowls and cups sized for tiny hands, decorated with cheerful colors. Mrs. Patterson and the other women in town were excited about the coming baby, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. Grace felt embraced by the community in a way she had not experienced since her father's death. She was no longer alone. She had Colt and their baby, and she had friends who cared about her. In early October, after a day of mild contractions that Grace had tried to work through, her labor began in earnest. Colt sent for Mrs. Patterson, who had experience as a midwife, and then proceeded to pace the small house like a caged mountain lion, his worry palpable. "I am fine," Grace assured him between contractions. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "That does not make it any less terrifying," Colt muttered, but he held her hand and supported her as Mrs. Patterson directed. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and as dawn broke over the Arizona desert, Grace gave birth to a healthy baby boy. When Mrs. Patterson placed the squalling infant in her arms, Grace felt a love so profound it took her breath away. "A son," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Colt, we have a son." Colt knelt beside the bed, looking at the tiny red-faced baby with wonder and awe. When he reached out a finger and the baby's impossibly small hand wrapped around it, Grace saw her strong mountain man break down and cry. "He is perfect," Colt said hoarsely. "Thank you, Grace. Thank you for this gift." They named him James after Grace's father, with the middle name Cole after his father. Little James Osborne proved to be a relatively easy baby, sleeping well and nursing without problems. Grace took a few weeks away from pottery work to recover and bond with her son, but she was eager to return to her craft. Colt proved to be a devoted father, surprising Grace with his natural aptitude for childcare. He held James for hours, talking to him in his deep, rumbling voice about the mountains and desert, about pottery and beauty, about the love between his parents. When James cried in the night, Colt was often the first to wake, soothing his son while Grace rested. As James grew from infant to toddler, the workshop expanded. Colt and Grace hired a young man named Thomas to help with the heavy work, freeing up more time for Grace to focus on the artistic aspects of pottery, and for both of them to enjoy their son. James's first word was "Mama," but his second was "clay," which made both his parents laugh with delight. He loved being in the workshop, playing in the safe spaces Colt had created for him, watching with fascination as his mother shaped earth into beautiful forms. When James was 2, Grace became pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the first, with more sickness and fatigue, but Colt was there every step of the way, supporting her and taking on more of the business responsibilities to give her time to rest. Their daughter arrived in the spring, a tiny girl with Colt's gray-blue eyes and Grace's dark hair. They named her Alina after Colt's mother. Where James had been an easy baby, Alina was demanding and spirited, crying often and sleeping little. But Grace and Colt adored her, and James proved to be a loving big brother, always wanting to help care for his baby sister. The years passed in a happy blur of work and family. Grace's pottery business became renowned throughout the Arizona territory. Her pieces were displayed in the finest homes and even began to be shipped back east, where collectors appreciated the unique designs and quality craftsmanship. Colt never returned to his trapping life. He found everything he needed in Camp Verde with Grace and their children. He became a respected member of the community, known for his fairness, his strength, and his devotion to his family. He taught James and Alina about the natural world, taking them on hikes through the desert to learn about plants and animals, teaching them survival skills while Grace taught them about art and creativity. The kiln that Colt had rebuilt stood strong through the years, firing load after load without fail. It became something of a legend in Camp Verde, a symbol of what could be achieved through skill, determination, and love. People would point it out to visitors, telling the story of the potter whose kiln kept breaking down and the mountain man who rebuilt it stronger, not knowing that in doing so, he had also rebuilt her life and her heart. When James was 10 and Alina was 8, they took a family trip to the mountains of Colorado, visiting the area where Colt had once trapped. He showed them his old haunts, the valley where his cabin had stood, the streams where he had set his trap lines. The children were enthralled, and Grace was moved to see this part of her husband's past, to understand the solitary life he had left behind for her. "You ever miss it?" she asked one evening as they sat by their campfire, the children asleep in the tent Colt had erected. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity," Colt admitted, "but I would not trade what we have for anything. That life was about surviving. This life with you and our children is about truly living." They returned to Camp Verde with James declaring he wanted to be a mountain man when he grew up, and Alina insisting she was going to be a potter like her mother. Grace and Colt exchanged amused glances, knowing that their children would ultimately choose their own paths, but happy that they had strong role models to follow. As the years continued to pass, Grace's father's old workshop was expanded into a larger facility. They took on more apprentices, teaching young people the art of pottery and providing good employment to the community. Colt's business acumen helped turn what had been a one-woman operation into a thriving enterprise that employed a dozen people. But despite the business's growth, Grace never lost touch with the craft itself. She still spent time at her wheel every day, still found joy in the feel of clay beneath her hands, still marveled at the transformation that occurred in the kiln that Colt had built. James grew into a young man with his father's height and strength, but also his mother's artistic sensibility. He became skilled at pottery, eventually taking over much of the production work while Grace focused on design and custom pieces. Alina inherited her mother's talent and her father's determination, creating innovative designs that pushed the boundaries of what pottery could be. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Colt and Grace stood together in the workshop, looking at the kiln that had brought them together. It showed signs of age now, some of the bricks weathered, but it still functioned perfectly, still fired pottery to perfection. "I should probably rebuild this soon," Colt said, examining the structure with a critical eye. "Make sure it lasts another 20 years. "Or we could let James and Alina do it," Grace suggested. "Teach them the proper way, the way the Puebloan people taught you. Keep that knowledge alive." Colt smiled and pulled her into his arms. "You always think of the bigger picture of legacy and future." "That is one of the many reasons I love you." "Only one of the reasons," Grace teased, wrapping her arms around his still strong waist. 20 years of hard work had not diminished his strength, though his hair was now streaked with gray and his face showed the lines of a life well lived. I could list the reasons all day and not finish. He kissed her softly. Thank you, Grace, for saying yes when I offered to rebuild your kiln, for giving me a chance, for loving me even when I was rough around the edges. You are still rough around the edges, Grace said with a laugh. But they are my favorite edges. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching through the window as James helped a young apprentice load the kiln for its evening firing. Alina was at her wheel, completely absorbed in the piece she was creating. The workshop hummed with productive activity, the sound of people working together to create beauty and utility from simple earth. We built something good here, Colt said quietly. Not just the kiln or the business, but a family, a legacy. We did, Grace agreed. And it all started with a kiln that kept breaking down and a mountain man brave enough to rebuild it. As the sun set over Camp Verde, casting long shadows across the Arizona desert, the kiln roared to life, its flames reflected in the windows of the workshop. Inside, pottery waited to be transformed by heat and time into something permanent and beautiful. Much like the love between Grace and Colt had been transformed by time and commitment into something that would last forever. Their story became part of Camp Verde's history, told and retold over the years. The tale of the potter and the mountain man who found love in the most unexpected of places, who built not just a kiln but a life together, who proved that sometimes the things that break can be rebuilt even stronger than before. And in that rebuilt kiln, generation after generation of pottery was fired, each piece carrying with it a small part of the love story that had made it all possible. The kiln stood for decades more, long after Grace and Colt had passed into legend, a testament to the power of determination, skill, and most of all, love. But that was far in the future. For now, on this evening of their 20th anniversary, Grace and Colt simply stood together in the workshop they had built, watching their children carry on the craft they had perfected, and felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived and a love that had endured. The kiln roared, the clay transformed, and love continued to grow in the heart of the Arizona desert, exactly as it should.